Hello, everybody. This is Harold George, the Extension Services Manager for your St. Johns County Public Library System. And it's such an honor today to have with us Susan Carol McCarthy, an author of several wonderful books. We came to know Miss McCarthy through the St. John's Reads experience a few years back when we featured her book, Lay That Trumpet in Our Hands. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you again.
It's, I can't believe the first time I saw you speak it's been about 13 years. I know, time flies when, time does indeed fly.
And you look just the same.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you. We do what we can. One of the nice things about Zoom is we can adjust the lighting and the angle. If you saw what was in front of me, it looks like some kind of Rube Goldberg illustration, but it works. So something that was kind of fun, and I'm always looking for signs and reinforcements of good things, is so we've been listening to this podcast called Unspooled. It's about all the films on the American Film Institute's 100 list, and when we know they're going to do a podcast about a film, we always watch it ahead of time. So Saturday night I watched It Happened One Night with Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. And one of the things that, it's a lot of great elements, but one of my favorite moments that said, hey, light bulb, was he refers to the blanket, that scene where he hangs the blanket between their beds to give them some privacy, as the walls of Jericho. And I thought, that's perfect, because the first time I ever saw you asked an entire room at a conference to essentially sing phrases from the old song, the Walls of Jericho, if I remember it correctly.
Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. Yeah.
That is. So we'll start off there if that works for you. Lay That Trumpet in Our Hands is a reference to that story. And I'm wondering how you connected the two.
Well, honestly, my father did. Lay That Trumpet in Our Hands is my father's story of him deciding somebody needed to go up against the Klan and nobody was, and he opted to do it. And before he took his action, he said a prayer. And I said, well, can you remember what that prayer was, Dad? And he goes, not the exact words, but I do know I felt like Joshua going up against the Great Wall of Jericho, because the Klan was everywhere and in charge of everything. And he goes, so I felt like Joshua, but I didn't have a trumpet. In the Bible story, Joshua has 7 trumpeters who walk around the great city of Jericho 7 times for 7 days. And when the final trumpet blew, the walls of Jericho, according to the Bible story, came tumbling down. So my dad said, I felt like Joshua, but I didn't have a trumpet. But what I thought was, if I could go into the Klan's secret headquarters, if I could find their record books, that would be a trumpet if I could find them. And so his prayer was essentially, if you lay that trumpet in our hands when we go in to search for these record books, we'll blow it. And by that, it meant provide those records to the FBI, which he did, I'm proud to say.
The entire book is amazing. I've read it several times, I'm happy to say. And that chapter, I reread the chapter that the prayer shows up in earlier this morning, just to get myself, in the mental state for our conversation today. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm always, when I watch movies or read books, I'm always looking for what prompted the title. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. But what I especially liked about that moment was how that prayer and the meeting of the people coming together to do this really dangerous task, you were in the room with them. Mm. And I mean, I could practically hear like the frogs and the crickets outside at night, because it must have been so quiet in that scene. And there's several scenes. What I appreciate about it is that you have not lived in Florida for many years. Mm-hmm. And of course you visit your family, but you are truly someone who knows how to make Florida come alive. All of it, the good, the bad, the not so pretty. But what I love was this sense of time and place. And my first thought was, who is Risa? Where did she
Well,
come from?
okay, Risa is the main character. She's the narrator, and she is not me. Um,
No.
the backstory is my father was in his 70s, and it appears to me that people reaching their 70s, they look back on their life and say, what did I do? What mattered about my life? And my father had never spoken about the story that's in the book to us. We were small. I mean, it happened the year I was born. I'd never heard it. And he sat down and wrote a letter to each of my four brothers and to me, saying, I want you, you know, everybody in town knew about the Klan, but no one was willing to do anything about it. I want you to hear from the horse's mouth what I did and why I did it. And the letter went on to lay out the story of Lay That Trumpet in Our Hands. When I sat down, since I was a writer, my father, in the corner of my letter, he sent the letter to each of the five of us, but in my letter, he said, you're the writer, write this. And he really bugged me for a very long time. And I finally, thank God, got around to writing it the year before he died. But I struggled to write it from his point of view because, well, first I wanted to write it like a journalist, third person, objective, and I couldn't get there. I couldn't be objective about the story. So I thought, well, Dad's letter is first person narrative. I'll write it from Dad's perspective. And I just couldn't get into my father's head well enough that it rang true to me. So my second thought was, well, I'll write it from my mother's perspective. By that time, I was a wife and mother, and I failed at that also because my mother is a much nicer person than I am, and she was allowed her husband to go off to the Klan headquarters, which I never would. And so I finally kept coming down to telling it from a daughter's perspective, but I couldn't be the daughter because I was born. Well, the first murder in the story occurs before I was born. So I struggled, and I finally called my dad and I said, Dad, I've been struggling with this. I really want to write your story. I'd like to write it from a daughter's perspective. How would you feel if I replaced my oldest brother, Fred, with the big sister I always wanted? And he said, really? I said, yeah. And he goes, honey, I don't care. Just write the damn thing. So once I got my dad's permission to replace my oldest brother with, when you're the only girl with four brothers, you really wish you had a big sister, you know, to even things out. And I knew just how she'd be. So once I replaced Fred with Risa, and I called her by name, I heard her voice in my head as clearly as if she was sitting right beside me. She's much braver, she's much smarter, she's much more self-possessed than I was at her age. But it was a real joy to give myself that big sister that I'd always wanted and let her narrate our family story.
And so once she came to surface, that's when things really started moving for you.
Yes.
With the story.
Yes.
Did you have to make many, if any, trips back to the state of Florida for your research, or were you able to find a lot of what you needed through what your father had shared with you, or even, you know?
It was a combination of, the first thing I did is start researching my father's letter. It was an 8-page letter. It had a lot of historical events and stuff. And so I started researching all the archives online that I could. And I never found anything in his letter that wasn't true and that I couldn't find backup for. But I also was coming back to Florida on a regular basis to see my family. And I think in retrospect, I had an advantage because I left Florida in 75. And so the Florida in my mind wasn't that far from the Florida of the book, whereas the Florida that is exists now is nothing like that. Well, there are still, parts of it that are like it. I'd say if you go out on some of the country roads, you wind up in old Florida, some of which I really love. But so for me, I could close my eyes and be there in the Florida of my childhood, and I still can. I still can.
You hadn't necessarily seen what had replaced it before you needed to depict it.
Right.
That must have been easier.
Yeah.
I think about, I remember the first time we heard about your book and the story. And one of the things that had really struck me was the response to your book and how it's showing up on reading lists, required reading lists for different school districts, colleges, and not just here in the United States, but around the world.
Yes.
Did you have any idea or hope that your book would be as received as well as it did?
Absolutely not. Honestly, my original thought was that it would be duplicated, Xeroxed and clipped together and passed around the family. I was not, I didn't have the kind of ego that said, I'm going to write a book and it's going to sell and it's going to go all over the world. No, that's really not who I am. I just wanted to do the best job on my dad's story that I could. And also at the time, my two sons were middle school, high school, and reluctant readers, I'd call them. And so in the back of my mind, I was trying to write the story in such a way that they would read it and really get into their grandfather for the hero that he was, because at that time he was considerably old. I mean, he was in his late 70s or mid 70s. And so I wanted it to be exciting enough that my sons would read it. And by doing that, by having them as my ideal reader, I accidentally, on purpose, made it acceptable to a whole lot of schools, because kids, particularly boys, what I was told at one point was, this is a book that boys get into because they, it's a battle of good versus evil, and I thought, well, then mission accomplished. My boys read it and really liked it, and that's really all I wanted.
Well, it has so many elements. I mean, it tells a really, really unpleasant part of the Florida story. It also, I like how you start off the tale talking about the Orange Blossom Trail and how, that served almost like the great river of Florida as much as any other state of, in the southern part of the United States would tell. So you get this depiction of old Florida. You also get this childhood story, but you also get a suspense tale. And the best part is that it's all based on fact. Was your father, like all the facts, do you think that at the time, do you think he managed to set down the facts that he shared with you in the letter way back when so he would remember him? Or do you remember the facts, or do you think that he pulled that from his memory?
I just think it was a very vivid memory to him. And he referenced what was going on. It was very clear to him the civil unrest and the bombings that were going. I mean, there were a dozen bombings statewide in throughout 1951. And the first murder, lynching that occurred was local in the Plymouth-Apopka area. So he definitely was aware of that. He was aware of the coming trial for the Groveland, the 3 of the Groveland 4 that were still alive and in jail. And also it was vivid to him that day, an FBI agent walked into his business, our business, and said, do you know anything about this business, this Klan, this killing of the state NCP leader over in Brevard County? And these were very vivid memories for him. And going into the Klan headquarters was extremely vivid. He remembered it. I mean, it wasn't all in the letter, but when I called him and I, walked him through it step by step. He was extremely detailed in his description.
And it's in the book, the headquarters are described. It almost sounds like the boardroom of a bank or some fraternal lodge or something like that.
Well,
is that all based on what your father told you about?
Absolutely. And also I write about the teenager that worked for our family business who went in with him, and I was able to track him down. He remained friends with my parents, and so I was able to talk to him as well. And the thing was, it looked like a little fishing camp on the outside. It was on this little lake off Boy Scout Road in Apopka. And a part of the story is that one of my older brothers went home with a friend, and the friend lived in that orange grove, and they ran through the orange grove to climb up on the water tower that was overlooking the lake and the fishing camp. And when they got up there, they were going to pea shoot alligators that hung out at in the lake. And instead of seeing alligators, what they saw were Klansmen in full regalia, white sheets, pointy hats, marching 2 by 2 into what was a fishing camp, they thought. Turned out it was the secret headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan, the Apopka Klan. Wow. And my brother was 8. This is my brother Bruce and his friend. And instead of pea shooting, they blew little ghost noises through their pea shooters, going woo, woo, you know, and it's like the mind of an 8-year-old boy.
I have no idea.
And someone with a shotgun turned and fired on the water tower. Fortunately, they had birdshot, not buckshot, because I might have lost a brother that day. And my father was furious, absolutely furious. And that pretty much was the incident, the thing that made him absolutely resolve he was going to do something about this. So when they went to the Klan headquarters outside, it looked like a fishing camp, you know, raw wood and everything, but you open it up and it was like a fraternal hall with this big raised dais at the end and these big longhorns over the dais, and it was red and black, and it was a scary place.
It sounds very scary. I think about the fact that, you know, like I think about the experiences that led up to the main, you know, storyline of your book, talking about the bombings, talking about the murder of the Moors, and in the factual history, you know, try not to give away too much about the book for those who haven't read it yet. Was your father, did he take it upon himself to contact the FBI, or was he actually contacted?
They were, because of the murder of Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriet, their FBI came down to Florida, and they were canvassing first the state, but then they tended to narrow down on Orange County, because Orange County was known to have 3 very active claverns, they call their little clubs. One in Apopka, one in Winter Garden, Ocoee, and one in Orlando. And they really suspected that one of those clans had been involved in the bombing of the Moore's home and the killing of Harry T. Moore and his wife. And so they were driving up and down the trail. They were interviewing people whose names they had, but then they were also kind of just canvassing the area. And my parents had a citrus business right on the trail, open to the public. You know, we had groves, and we sold citrus and fresh juice and souvenirs and all that stuff to the public. And so they just wheeled into my parents' business, Beaumac Groves, and walked in and said, hey, we're from the FBI and we're just looking for information. Do you have any information? And the FBI agent gave my dad his card and said, because my dad said, well, number one, I'm from Chicago and I don't truck with these people. And they said, well, would you consider going undercover? And he said, well, I doubt they let me in. And then even if they did, I wouldn't last long at all. And they said, okay, well, if you hear anything, let us know. And it was that card that my father used after the Klan shot at my brother and his friend up on the water tower to warn them that there was going to be some dynamite at the Klan headquarters.
Wow.
Because my father's original intention was to blow it up. I mean, he had dynamite. Everybody had dynamite at the time in Florida. You could buy it at the hardware store because they used it to clear land, these big palmetto stands of palmetto. You couldn't dig them out or, yank them out. So they would blow them out with dynamite. So everybody had dynamite back then. And
it's crazy to think about, but I guess you're right.
Yeah.
When you read tales of these experiences in the past, and unfortunately a little closer to the present, or you think about, like the experience of hiding the Jews during World War II, you always find yourself, when you read these books, you're hoping to learn more, but you also are hoping that somehow it's connecting with that little part of you that's maybe deep inside, maybe it's on the surface, that in the present circumstance, you would find that you did the right thing as well. So it must be like such a great source of pride to know that your dad did the right thing at that time. And to think that, that it was just the infusion of these people passing by one day at your store. One of the things I remember you mentioning once, though, is even though you weren't around, or you were, barely around at the time that this was all happening, you sensed that there was something in the air sometime in the community when your family encountered certain members of the community. Do you mind talking about that?
Sure. So my father's intention in going into the Klan headquarters was to get their record books, which they succeeded in finding. It was in a hidden section, but they had these little rubber ball peen hammers, and they went around tapping for the hollow area where they kept their record books. And so they actually got those record books, took them home, looked at them, and then sent them to the FBI. And the record books, my dad said, read just like the Chamber of Commerce. It was everybody you can imagine, plus many members of law enforcement were all members of the local Apopka Klan. It was kind of like the JCs or Chamber of Commerce. And so my father knew from that point on who was a Klansman and who wasn't. And although he didn't explain this to me till much, much, much later, I was aware as a girl that when I would be riding around with my dad in his pickup truck, we'd go to, get gas or get a part for the tractor or go down and pick up fertilizer. We would be running into other men from the community. And there were certain men that when we ran into them, my father was less himself. He was normally a very outgoing guy, knew everybody, and was, we were very active in the church and the community. So he knew most people. It wasn't that big of a town, and most people knew him. But one-on-one, I would sense him being different. And at the same time, I went to school with the kids of all these Klansmen, and I was aware that there were certain homes. I could be friends with the kids, no problem, but I was not allowed to spend the night in their homes. And that was just the rule. And I didn't know, I had no idea. I just thought, they were being protective, whatever. It was the 50s and early 60s, and you just accepted what you were told. You did what you were told. And it wasn't until much later when my dad, asked me to tell this story that I went down the list of names that he could recall, saying, so that's why I couldn't go to her house. And that's why you wouldn't let me go to that sleepover or whatever. So it kind of was a puzzle piece from my childhood that fell into place much later when I realized the background and this story, when I learned it.
In the book, I guess you could say that the character based upon your father struck almost, I guess, I don't know if the word is truce, but the conclusion of the book sets, your family didn't get run out of town, so to speak. Do you think that any of these people understood your father's role at the time?
I think many of them suspected it, but my father was very philosophical at the end when we were discussing this, and what he said was his initial inclination, as most people was for some Old Testament judgment, an eye for an eye. Okay, you shot at my son, shouldn't have done that, so I'm going to steal your record books and give them to the FBI. And that was a retaliation. And my father said the problem with retaliation is it leads to escalation.
Right.
That's Old Testament justice. He said New Testament justice, he said when Jesus said, turn the other cheek, it didn't mean, in my father's thinking, to be a coward, lie down, take whatever they're giving you. What he felt it meant was be creative, do something they're not expecting. And
Like
so what no one was expecting was that my father would go right to the head of the Klan and negotiate. And he was smart enough about the psychology of it that he knew this man would be a sucker for a gentleman's agreement. And it was that gentleman's agreement between my father and the head of the Klan that enabled us to stick around. But it was New Testament justice. It was doing something unexpected, completely out of the ordinary, that changes the dynamics between you from enemies into negotiators, and it was diplomacy. And so, as my father explained it, retaliation leads to escalation. Negotiation can lead to a solution. And
wow, and it's I think that this is someone that lived and breathed, and you knew. It must have been so. You must have been really quite startled when you opened that letter and read your father's tale.
Well, there were aspects of it that were shocking to me, and there were newspaper clippings too. And because about this same time in the 90s, the upshot of all these events that happened in 1951, which involved a federal grand jury down in Miami, they found that they could indict 6 Klansmen, 5 of them from Apopka. The upshoot was that the state of Florida told the federal grand jury, well, thank you very much, you've done a fine job with all this investigating, but this is all state crimes, and we will handle it in state. And the way they handled it in state was to seal the records for 40 years.
Oh my God.
So nothing ever happened initially. 40 years later, 1991, these events occurred in 1951. 1991, a reporter from the Orlando Sentinel had filed a Freedom of Information Act filing, opened up all the records from that grand jury, and started writing front page stories in the Orlando Sentinel. And it was those stories that my father also included with his letter, because he wanted us to know, he was concerned that maybe his anonymity might be compromised somehow, because he was promised anonymity by the FBI, but he worried. And so that his point was, you know what, if my story's going to come out, I want it to be my story.
He wants to be in control of the story.
Exactly. So that's what prompted him writing the letter and me writing the book, was that the stories had all these names of all the fathers of all my friends, and it was like, oh my gosh. So that was shocking. What was not shocking is who my father was. My father was a person for whom doing the right thing was not optional. If you knew the right thing, you did the right thing, that's it. End of story. And so, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times we'd be driving down the road and somebody would be broken down on the side of the road, and we all go, oh God, because every time my father would stop to see if he could help. This is who he was. So it didn't surprise me that my father did the right thing. It did surprise me all of the events that led up to his action, and the fact that as a Florida kid growing up in the very place where it happened, I knew none of it, and nobody did.
Wow. Well, your parents, sounds like your parents protected you in the best way they could.
They did.
Wow. Well, and that's, I often used to tease that my father was very similar. And of course, it always seemed like these things would happen when you were on your way to having some fun as opposed to trying to be a good Samaritan. But we were always glad that that was our dad, because
Yeah.
we were the lucky ones for
Yeah,
sure.
I agree. I agree.
So one of the things that I think, at least the way I see it, has been one of the more wonderfully surprising experiences is that this book has taken you to quite a few places around the country. And
Yes.
you've met and been able to meet a lot of people. And do I remember correctly that you have, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Moore?
I did. I did. So, and there were so many blessings that came out of this book, but this was a huge one. I realized when I was writing my father's story that I was also writing another father's story, and there was another daughter. I was writing about my dad and the murder of Harry T. Moore. He was such an amazing guy. He's the guy who started the NAACP in Florida. He's the guy who founded the Progressive Voters League and had 100,000 Black voters, more than any other Southern, signed up 100,000 Black voters, more than any other Southern state. And he was fighting the good fight, and he was investigating every lynching that happened in the state of Florida. He would drive and gather and put a file together. It was actually his file that I used to detail the murder of Melvin Womack, the first murder in our area. And so he had daughters. Both he and his wife died, but they had 2 daughters. And I found through my research that the older one had died, but the younger one, Evangeline, was still out there. And so I was on the hunt to find her, and I wanted her to read the manuscript before it went to press. I wanted her to tell me that I had represented her father accurately. And so I started with the Brevard County NAACP and many calls. I finally found someone and explained what I was doing and why I wanted to contact her. And they said, well, she doesn't live in Florida and she doesn't come to Florida very often. But what I will do is I will put her in touch with you, or I will call her and tell her you want to talk to her, and I will give her your number. And if she wants to talk to you, she'll call you. So I was on pins and needles for quite some time. And then the phone rang, and this wonderful, melodious voice on the other end said, Susan, this is Evangeline Moore. And I said, well, I'm doing this, and I really would like for you to read it. And so I was able to send it to her. And she read it over the weekend very fast and called me back and said, that's my daddy, you got him. And thrilled, absolutely thrilled. Then the libraries of Tampa Bay chose Lay That Trumpet in Our Hands for their all read, one book, one community read. And they asked me, the librarian asked me, they said, is there anything special you want? And I guess some authors are kind of weird. You would know this in their requests, like get rid of all the red M&Ms or something. I don't know what people request. But my request was, do you think Evangeline could come? And they said, do you think she would? And I said, if I ask her, I think she might. And so they approved the budget, and I called Evangeline in Baltimore, and she came down, and we were able to go through all of those events in the Bay Area together. Wow. And we became great friends and were until she died. But she got to, when Michigan State University chose Trumpet for their freshman year read, she and I went together, and we got to present to 6,000 freshmen.
Wow.
And she told me later that, sorry, got a phone going on here. She told me later that when I first contacted her, she was depressed because the 50th anniversary of her parents' murder was coming up in 2001, and no one was doing anything about it. And she was being treated for clinical depression.
Mm.
But when I talked to her, I told her, Evangeline, I will never speak about my father without acknowledging yours. And any chance that I have to do that, I will. Well, the fact that then she got to join me was wonderful. And then over time, people started recognizing her parents, and a whole lot of wonderful things happened that should have happened. But early on, she was afraid she might die without having fulfilled their legacy, had made it known on a broader scale. And so we did that. She did that too. And it's one of the great things that happened.
It's one of the most wonderful parts of storytelling, and that is that it can bring people, into vivid existence and that you can see.
Mm-hmm.
And so something about this story clicked with the folks at Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember how that got started? That's one of the things that has always impressed me, is that this book has connected with such a broad range of community.
I asked the same thing when I got the call, because at the time I'd never even been to Michigan. And I wound up going back to 2 more colleges and several high schools. And apparently there were some big racial issues in Michigan that some brave librarians and educators wanted to confront. And they thought this book was a good way to do it. And again, for freshman year read, they said, it's really important we pick a book that is as popular with boys as it is with girls. And in our survey, your book accomplished exactly that, which was like, great, we're going to Michigan.
I think that's the best. I mean, it really comes down to the fact that you needed to find the right voice to tell the story. And then you made the audience so personal. And then everything else just happened because of the right way it got started.
Yeah, well, maybe so. Maybe so. I have to say, my father handed me a hell of a story.
Well, he had faith in you. And of course, I imagine you felt just a little bit obligated to tell that story.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And that's one of the things that I think is wonderful, if you can tell a story that and sometimes a person won't tell their own story because the very thing that makes them heroic is the thing that also makes them humble.
Yeah.
And their life.
I had a gentleman locally here in California who was an amazing success, and he heard about me, and he actually read my father's story, and he contacted me and he said, I'd like to tell you my story. And I said, okay. And we met and had dinner, and he told me his story, and he said, is this a story you'd like to write? And I said, it's a great story, but you really should be the one to write it. And he goes, well, he says, no, in fact, I want you to change all the names and everything and not mention me at all. And I said, but that doesn't make any sense. You were a public figure. You were head of this very famous corporation, and then you moved to that one and were a big success. How could I write without naming who you are? And he goes, well, I wouldn't want to be called out by name. Therefore, I guess, I said, well, I'm not sure we can do this. And he goes, I guess we can't.
He wasn't ready.
I said, it's a wonderful story, and I'd be delighted to help you tell it, but you would be the one that people are going to want to talk to. And it never went anywhere because he didn't have that what it took to put himself out there, even though it was a great American rags to riches success story. But
it is interesting how, I mean, I mean, it's such a personal experience when someone tells their story. One time I had a ghost story that I told to an author. He compiled like St. Augustine ghost stories, and it was really my grandmother's ghost story. And I remember when I read it, I suddenly felt like I had done. I felt like suddenly I was standing in the middle of a large field, the overwhelming moment when I was like, I just revealed something deeply personal that I'm not really sure it was mine to reveal.
Right.
And you're like, oh gosh, now it's never going to be, the genie is not going back in the bottle.
Yeah.
So I imagine like when you tell this kind of story, when you write something so personal, it's got to take a very real physical and emotional toll on you as far as the experience of writing goes.
Well, and I have to say, I went through several drafts with my editor, and she kept coming back to say, I wish you'd write more about your mother, because it doesn't she's not exactly making sense to me. And I said, well, geez, one of the pivotal parts in my mother's story that made her who she was the loss of her father at age 16. And it changed everything in her life. She had hoped to go to college. She wasn't able to go to college. It forced her mother to go to work. And because her mother went to work for my father's father. And that's how she connected with my father. And so everything spooled out of the death of my grandfather when my mother was a teenager. But I wasn't sure I could write about that. And I had to call her and say, Mother, they're wanting more information about you. How would you feel about me, telling the story of you losing your dad and how that formed who you are? Because she was a very private, quiet person. My dad was the big personality and she was the more quiet one. I compared them. He was the sun and she was the moon, and so in our family. And she goes, well, let me think about that. She had to think about if she wanted those details of her life in the book. And ultimately she said, well, if you think it'll make the book better, then go ahead and put it in, But yeah, and it's
mom for you, right?
yeah. So it's an interesting thing to put your stuff out there, because in some ways you're revealing more than you even know. And I think at the end of the day, you have to feel good about who you are and what you're revealing, because it's out there. It's in there. It's out there.
I remember once saying to you that when people read the book, they're convinced they know you.
Exactly. And that's why I always say, well, look, I'm not Risa. No. Risa is my older sister, the one that I gave myself. So, think, no, you don't know me.
And this book is more about your father and the characters than anything else in that story. So, just a quick mention that there are other books that you have written that are set in Florida and very interesting. I want to say True Fires.
True Fires.
Yes. We read that one, and that story. And did you discover that story along the way of researching the Trumpet book, or was that a story you were already aware of?
I came across it, but my father suggested it. He goes, if you're going to write another book, you should write about that family in Lake County that were accused of being Black and kicked out of the white school. And so he really pointed me in that direction.
And then, of course, A Place We Knew Well.
Yes.
Is I'm thinking, that you probably had a little more firsthand knowledge about the topic of Florida during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what I love is that the story, the way you've depicted Florida, is that it's the whole world was on edge, but Florida had a front row seat in a way that made this was the first place that was going to go if something happened. And were there any characters in that story that you would say were based upon people that you knew, or was it more about the storytelling and these are more characters that formed in your head, like Risa?
Um, the a place we knew well came out of 9/11 for me. After 9/11, I started having nightmares, but in my nightmares, I wasn't a wife and a mother living in California. I was a 10-year-old girl scared out of my wits in the middle of an orange grove in Florida. And I thought, what's that all about? And it took me, it was a recurring nightmare of the world coming apart. And it took me a while to realize that my subconscious had connected the feeling that people in Florida had during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the world was going to hell, we're going to die. Some people had, places to go and stay and protect their families. Some people didn't, and it was so tense. And I had vivid memories of planes flying overhead and trains going by full of bombs and missiles and tanks and napalm and all of this. It took me a while to realize that my subconscious had connected my boys and my reaction to 9/11 with my personal experience as a 10-year-old during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I thought, wow, I've never read about that. I remember things, but there's no book about it. And I Googled Floridians' experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I couldn't find another book about it. And so I thought, I'm going to write that book, because I had very vivid memories, and it was fun to go and connect my vivid memories to the historical truth. Now, we had this neighbor who was ex-Air Force and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he would come over and talk to my dad and say, you see those planes? Those aren't defenses, those are offensive planes. And he would name them and everything. So he really was the inspiration for the father, the main character in A Place We Knew Well, because it was helpful to have a main character who could read the skies and realize that all of the defensive B-52s left Florida, and all of the offensive planes, in case we were to invade Cuba, were flying in and taking up every spare bit of runway out at McCoy and at other bases in Florida. And the fact that the U-2s that were the spy planes providing information to President Kennedy on a regular basis were based at Orlando's McCoy, just all of this wonderful history came. And I kind of got lost in the research for a number of years, which is why that book took me so long. But that book was kind of amalgam. I gave the main character a business right on the trail, like my parents had, because we were front row seats to all those convoys and what was going by on the trains and all the airplanes overhead. And so he's kind of an amalgam of a number of people.
I think there must be something very satisfying sometimes in being able to create realities for people or combinations of people that you knew in such a way that can either be satisfying, comforting, or a little bit of Schadenfreude when you can say, well, this character is not going to end up so well.
Yeah.
But it impresses me to read your books, and when I was a young person, fortunately I'm blessed with a really good memory, because Florida has changed a lot since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
But we used to spend a lot of time going to parts of South. There was a place called, I don't even know if I say it correctly anymore, because I don't know who says it. O'Galley. The closest probably would be Melbourne.
We called it O'Galley. We called it O'Galley. I don't know. Yeah.
My father's people probably could have used a little help with that. Or we would go to parts of the Panhandle that were just so different from just this Northeast Florida little area than I. And we really felt like we were stepping back in time. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I really have responded to in your books is that you have captured that sense of what we call old Florida, which we would be like
Yes.
1950s Florida.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, Florida's not so, it's so old, so we take what we can get.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I appreciate that. And one of the things that I had been thinking about, you know, we every year we do St. John's Reads,
Hmm.
and this year we may change the month of it so we can do focus on a different book. But I I get made fun of a lot here, and my friends. A shout out to my friend Karen Maxwell. She teases me about the fact that I don't read fiction as much as a person probably would benefit from doing. But I remember when it came time to propose your book, I had to read all the other candidates so I could speak with some credence that yes, I'd considered all of them, but this is a book. And fortunately, you know, so you've got me to read probably like 6 pieces of fiction that I might not have read that year, but the cream still rises to the top for sure.
Well, I know you're a history buff, and
Oh, I
and
love it.
and I take great pride in the fact that if I write historical fiction, and the history, check it all you want, the history is true. My characters may be fictional, but I'm writing about true history. Um, I, I when I was a kid, my favorite TV show was Walter Cronkite, and he would they would use the correspondence of CBS, and they would recreate these historical events like Washington crossing the Delaware, and they would set their correspondence with with things going on behind them. And Walter Cronkite would say, "It was a day like no other in history, and you are there." And then at the end, he'd say, "And you were there." And that's my mantra when I try to write, when I do write about a historical event, is I want it to feel like you are there, or you were there with these people. It's an immediacy, and it's a visceral experience that I aspire to create for you.
Well, you've done a great job, and also sounds totally random, but I tried snickerdoodles for the first time because of your book. So, you know, I was paying
Did you
attention.
like them?
I did like them.
Good.
You know? They weren't anything like what I thought they would be, but they were really good.
Yeah.
But I just thought, wow, wait, and I don't remember anybody actually eating the snickerdoodles in that chapter.
Yeah.
And of course, in my imagination, if I'd been there in that scene, I would have eaten all of them because that's how I would have dealt with my worry and stress over that moment.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's time for us to let you get back to your day and everything that you're doing. Do you have anything in the works that, you know, I'm sure you might have to keep secret, but
Yeah, I won't go in too much detail, but it is even older Florida, set in the 30s,
oh, cool.
which
Well,
is which is really, Florida was quite new when you think in the 30s. It was before the big population explosion of the 50s. In the 50s, they invented a way to make frozen juice concentrate, and that was a big part of why Florida exploded. The citrus business exploded, the population exploded in the 50s. But in the 30s, Florida was a much different place.
it's amazing. I was a late life child. I was born way back after when my parents were, well into their middle age, and then my mother was, and so there were all these older folks around us who they just all looked like, old folks from a movie or something. They were sweet, they were friendly. We didn't necessarily give them the time of the day, but my mother would tell their stories. And it sounds like just everybody that was in Florida at that time was just on the edge of being a pioneer and a little bit of a buccaneer. And there was a wildness to Florida that it's a lot like a cat or a horse. I don't know if we've ever been truly domesticated. I don't know if we can be, that's for sure.
It's
Well,
true.
I really am grateful for your time. And we'll definitely be sharing this and information about Lay That Trumpet in Our Hands with our public, because it's a book, I'm happy to say, that has stayed in our circulation. We don't tell too many people about this, but if a book doesn't get checked out often enough over a certain amount of time, we let it go off to a Friends of the Library book sale. But we have one at every one of our branches, which tells me that the book is doing pretty well here still. And it has a lot of cheerleaders. Well, thank you for sharing it with us, and thank you for this time today.
Thanks.
And we look forward to whatever you're writing about in the 1930s.
Well, don't hold your breath. My books take a while, but anyway,
They are worth waiting for. So thank you. Once again, I'm Harold George with the St. Johns County Library System. This is Susan Carol McCarthy, author of Lay That Trumpet in Our Hands, which is available at your St. Johns County Public Library System. Be in touch and we'll be glad to put it into your hands. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Harold.